whole plan. It's also working. Do you still hear me? Okay, good.
Yes.
So I would like to thank W3R and MPS, and especially, of course, Johnny Carawan to invite me tonight to give me the great opportunity to present my research tonight and also in the coming months, because it's going to be a lecture series of 6 evenings like this. I also want to thank Robert Seelig and Norman Desmarais, sorry if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, that are also here tonight for their precious research and writings on the French in the American Revolution. Their work has given important insights for my own research. So in the coming months, in 6 lectures, we will be following the footsteps of the officers and soldiers that walked on the what's today called Washington-Rochambeau revolutionary route that, of course, you're all very familiar with. And I'm going to put my slideshow on now so that you can come with me on this presentation. Okay, here we go. So I hope you can still see me and hear me. So on the route. So this, as you all know, of course, the Washington-Rochambeau revolutionary route covers 680 miles of land and water trails through different states of the United States. So on this route, the French Expeditionary Army walked from their encampment in Newport to New York to join the Continental Army, their ally. And from there, they walked together to Yorktown, the site of the siege and the Battle of Yorktown, where the British surrendered in October 1781. And this crucial battle led to the independence of the United States in 1783. So the focus of this route permits us to connect the past to the present, since many of the historical sites along the route have been preserved and can be today visited, thanks, of course, to the efforts of many of you that are now listening. So each of my lectures will follow this route, and so we'll focus on a specific site along the trail. This will permit to tell the events that occurred there, or lead to the development of a specific theme. And especially, they will reveal some unknown aspects of the route. So the concentration of the route is especially a wonderful opportunity to delve into the story of the French-American cooperation during the war. So generally speaking, historians have overlooked the French-American cooperation during the War of Independence. For Americans, traditionally, the fact that the American insurgents needed the French to achieve their independence did not feel that well in their nation-building narrative. For the French, proportionally to other wars that they fought during the 18th century, the American war paled in comparison. In addition, their own revolution of 1789 had received much more attention in French history books than the American Revolution. And even if, of course, Lafayette and in a lesser extent Rochambeau have received the attention of historians, most of the other French generals, officers, or diplomats have stayed understudied, even if often some of their journals or memoirs have been published since the 18th century. So the fact that these figures are forgotten, the French during the American Revolution, is related to their military rank. So I'm not talking again about Rochambeau and Lafayette, but the other in just a little lower ranks. But also because, of course, the historiographical traditions where they didn't fit in. But most importantly, most of their sources have gone lost. First of all, because of the French Revolution that destroyed many documents of the French aristocracy to which the French officers belonged, but also because of family inheritance practices that led to documents being shattered in many different locations and thus quite hard to find for historians. So besides lots of these documents being lost, there are sources preserved on French officers of the American Revolution. They are now kept, of course, in the public archives in Paris, such as the National Archives, military archives, or the diplomatic ones. And there's also many documents to be found in the American archives. But there's still a lot to uncover in more in more unexpected places throughout France, and especially outside of Paris. So this is the case for the papers of lesser known, what we could call unsung heroes of the American War of Independence. These are, for example, Dumas, we can see on the slide, the aide-de-camp of Rochambeau, but also Chastellux, the major general, La Luzerne, who was a diplomat, the French ambassador in the US during the American War of Independence, but also Le Baron de Viomesnil, who is another major general, as well as Montesquieu, which is of course a name that rings a bell, but it's the grandson of the famous philosopher who served as an aide-de-camp to Chastellux. So I will discuss these figures in the following weeks, but today I'll focus on Chastellux, who is in the middle. So the fact that sources are to be found outside of Paris is especially the case for the papers of Chastellux, which have formed the basis of my doctoral dissertation. I completed this dissertation in 2019, and it will be published very soon in France. And today I'm working on an adaptation of my research in English, which will be published in a year or maybe two by the University of Virginia Press. So the lecture that I present today is based on that research. And so by way of introduction, I'm sure that you're all familiar with the famous painting of Washington with his French allies. Like this one, you can see on the slide, by Charles Winston Peale, where Washington is preparing the Yorktown campaign with Rochambeau and Lafayette. Or this painting, of course, of John Trumbull depicting the surrender of Cornwallis, with the French army on the left and the Continental Army on the right. However, if we look more closely, you'll see that there is a figure that you might never have noticed on these paintings. It's the Chevalier de Chastellux. So he was one of the three, here he is too on the other painting in the background. So he was one of the three major generals serving directly under Rochambeau. And he played a central but overlooked role in the French Expeditionary Army. And he worked in very close collaboration with Washington and Rochambeau. He lived from 1734 to 1788. And if you have heard of him, it's likely because of his published travel diary, Voyage du Marquis Chastellux en Amérique septentrionale, based on his travels in America during his military campaign. So moreover, it's also likely that you don't know much more about him than being this author of the travel diary. And it can be stated that he has been relatively forgotten by history. So why did I come across him? The inspiration for this research came from a personal story. So it's coming from a tree, a 240-year-old tulip poplar that was planted, according to legend, by the Marquis de Lafayette in the garden of my parents' home in Burgundy. The owner of our house of the 18th century had given financial support to the French military expedition to North America during the American War of Independence. And in return, he received the, at the time, small American tree, which now stands tall at about 100 feet. So tulip poplars of the time period still stand at George Washington's Mount Vernon, that you can see on top of the slide, and until recently in Monticello too, where Jefferson lived. And so in France, the tulip poplar is called Tulipier de Virginie, and so the tree is known to come from Virginia. And so my research about this story led me to the nearby Château de Chastellux, located here in Burgundy, France, which is the family castle of an uncle by marriage of Lafayette. So remember that tree was maybe planted by Lafayette, but so his uncle used to live very close by. And so this is where, this is the Château de Chastellux you can see on the slide. And in one of the chateau's towers, together with the current heir, Philippe, who is joining this Zoom call today too, I discovered this archival treasure that has been hidden for over 2 centuries, the private papers of Chastellux. And the castle, you can see on the slide, of Roman origin, has belonged to successive generations of the Chastellux family for more than 1,000 years. And they have over time constructed, enlarged, and especially preserved it, which, as you can imagine, is quite an effort. So they have also preserved their family archive, of which the François-Jean de Chastellux papers are a part. And so Philippe de Chastellux, the current heir, here you can see a portrait that is there too. And I just want to make sure for Americans, because people tend to say Chastellux, because that's how you write it, but you have to pronounce it as Chastellux. So Philippe de Chastellux, the current heir of the Chastellux castle, after many negotiations, kindly gave me permission and access to his astonishingly complete private archive of François-Jean de Chastellux to conduct my research in there. And so they were kept, as I said, in the family archive, in the family archive in the castle, but they've been recently moved to another property. So they're not in the castle, in a property where Chastellux's wife and son used to live before. And so as you can see on these images, we've organized a conference with Mount Vernon, and as a sort of tour, we went to the archive, to the papers of François-Jean de Chastellux with a group of Americans. And so this archive contains numerous correspondences with prominent Frenchmen like Voltaire and Diderot, Scottish and Englishmen like Hume and Bentham, but also especially Americans like Jefferson and Washington. The archives also contain other unpublished material, like the private notes and manuscripts for the publications. And so here on this slide, you can see the signatures of Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin. And so you have to imagine that the first time I saw them, I was opening boxes without knowing that I was going to find them, of course. And so I opened a few boxes just looking for some material about the American Revolution. And I came across these original letters that are all kept in a perfect state with this ink that's still as dark as you can see here on the photos. So it was extremely exciting to find that. And I've decided to write a whole PhD dissertation on it. So I've been working on it for quite some time. Here you can see the handwriting of Lafayette, Rochambeau, and La Luzerne, who is at the time the French ambassador at Philadelphia. And so as an example of the numerous letters that I found, I'd like to draw attention to this one that's been written by Washington just when Chastellux was about to leave back to France. So he wrote about their relationship and said, "A deep and lasting friendship, a friendship with neither time nor distance can ever eradicate. I can truly say that never in my life did I part with a man to whom my soul clave more sincerely than it did to you." So you can see a real friendship between these two men, and it would continue even beyond the war, and they would stay in correspondence until 1788, which is the death of Chastellux. So furthermore, in the archive, there's also maps of the American Revolution. So here you can see a map of the Saratoga campaign with, of course, the French were not there yet, but the French were collecting maps to research the terrain and the war that had been previously fought already. So Chastellux collected these kind of maps, and there are quite some in the archive today. And so one of the most important, or at least interesting correspondences for me, were the letters that Chastellux wrote to his sister when he was in America. He wrote her very frequently, and so they form a very intimate and complete image of Chastellux's ideas and activities during his campaign, which is a great addition to what is today known through his travel diary. So all in all, as I already said, it's very rare to find such a complete and intact collection. And as I said, most of these have gone lost in time, or they have been scattered in different locations. And so largely based on his newly discovered archive, studying all his different writings, it can be argued that Chastellux was a paragon of an enlightened polymath. So the 18th century, of course, the age of the Enlightenment, and Chastellux is a real representative of that movement by being both a soldier, a philosopher, but also a scientist, a reformist, a historian, a musicologist, a playwright, and a socialite. He was involved in almost everything you can imagine. He was writing himself playwrights, he was writing on poetry, on music, but he was also very interested in, for example, the inoculation against the smallpox. And so he would read about it, but he would especially write about it himself too. And so because of this esteemed reputation as both a philosopher of the Enlightenment, the author of the famous book called Unpublished Happiness, which is a book about, as you can imagine, happiness. And so he was also a member of the Académie Française, which is a very prestigious intellectual group of the time. So he was a philosopher of the Enlightenment, but at the same time, he was an experienced officer in the in the army of Louis XV, but also Louis XVI. And so, being both a philosopher and this experienced officer in the old world, he immediately integrated himself among the leading intellectual, but also military figures of the New World during his expedition of 1780 until 83. And so Chastellux, by his ability to synthesize disparate disciplines, was the embodiment of the Enlightenment by applying his insights to practical matters. He was able to play a critical role in the American independence by doing that. And as we'll see today and more in depth during the next lecture, Chastellux brought an enlightened approach to warfare with him to America that would prove indispensable for the preparatory phase of the Battle of Yorktown. Moreover, he also forged relations between the French and American that went beyond the military realm. And by being an intermediary for commercial, intellectual, and scientific exchanges, he stood at the basis of the birth of French-American friendships that would last long through, of course, the present day. So based on the findings of these papers, I argue that Chastellux should be included on the long list of non-American individuals that shaped the outcome of the American War of Independence, alongside Lafayette, Duportail, von Steuben, and Kosciuszko. So this was just a little introduction of who Chastellux was. I will, of course, develop a bit further on him during the following lectures too. But of course, today I'm going to focus more on the Washington-Rochambeau route, and especially on the first, let's say, stage, or at least place on the route, which is Newport. So I'll use a few documents of the Chastellux papers to tell how it was for the French to arrive in Newport in July of 1780. So this is why it's called a suicide mission. You understand why quite quickly. So the French expedition under Rochambeau departed France in the spring of 1780. The War of Independence in America was already in its 5th year. And in short, the outcome of the 7 Years' War created the most motivations for France's participation in the American War of Independence. The defeat of 1763 forced the Crown to scale back its imperial aspirations and expose serious deficiencies in its military capabilities, because it lost the war so badly, it just exposed the issues of France. The defeat of 1763 forced the Crown to scale back. Oh, that's what I already said, I'm sorry. So since 1763, France pursued an anti-British foreign policy, instituted major military reforms, and expanded naval construction. And from beginning to end, France supported the Americans in their struggle for independence. In the early stages of the fighting, assistance came from young officers such as the Marquis de Lafayette, who volunteered his military expertise to help train and especially to lead the Continental Army. In addition, the French Crown secretly provided arms, uniforms, and other supplies to the American insurgents. When the British defeat at Saratoga in 1777 presented the prospect of American success, France began to openly support the rebellion. And in 1778, France formally recognized the colonists in the treaties of amity and commerce that they signed and negotiated by Benjamin Franklin, as seen on the image. So the Americans badly needed military expertise that the French could provide, but actually especially more men, money, and arms. And they knew that the French could provide that. So French motives had more to do, of course, with the persistent Franco-British rivalry than the greatness and justness of this American cause. Through this alliance with the American colonists, France hoped to drive a wedge between the different parts of Britain's American empire, thereby restoring its traditional role in the European balance of power. French merchants saw in the Franco-American alliance also a possibility of expanding their share of transatlantic trade. And so the French sent a first military naval expedition in 1778 under command of Shasta, which is an admiral. But this expedition was not really a success. In 1780, they sent a new expedition, this time with land troops under command of Rochambeau. So after a particularly long and exhausting transatlantic journey of about 10 weeks, the 5,500 French soldiers of Rochambeau transported by a squadron of over 30 ships with 7,000 sailors under command of l'Amiral de Ternay, the French could finally distinguish the vague silhouettes of the American shores. Their travel had been much longer than the usual 4 to 5 weeks. This was firstly because of the long path they took to avoid British attacks on sea, by a lack of wind that had prevented them from sailing for several weeks. Thirdly, when they almost reached their initially planned destination, which was the Chesapeake Bay to begin with.
Oh my goodness. Does that make you...
Please mute your microphones. Please mute your microphones.
So they finally thought they would reach the Chesapeake Bay because that was their planned destination. They clearly could identify British warships. And in Chastellux' description in his logbook of that moment, you can really feel he's extremely afraid because he sees these warships, he's not sure who they are, but he knows that it can become very dangerous. And so instead of engaging a sea battle immediately, it seemed safer to even sail further to Rhode Island. This was quite a disaster for the French since it added a full week of traveling aboard the vessels that were now infested with contagious diseases, such as scurvy, yellow fever, dysentery, but also other diseases that were very common on board of these very cramped ships in a rough climate, and especially with serious lack of provisions. So already 300 men had died, and the sanitary condition became uncontrollable. So when finally arriving on the shores of Newport, Chastellux felt, he said, the worst heat I have ever experienced in my life. And while sweating in his thick woolen military uniform, he went on a small boat with Rochambeau and a few other members of his staff. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon of July 11th, 1780, the little group of French officers finally set foot on American soil. The ships anchored in the bay and the soldiers stayed on board. And today, of course, as you see on the image, we can see the statue of Rochambeau standing here on this landing site. And of course, over the years, many events have been organized and will be organized soon too, to celebrate this French-American alliance. To go back to Chastellux and all his, let's say, brothers in arms, in addition to the terrible heat and especially the previous worries of being attacked by British, but also their fatigue after this voyage, upon their arrival on the dock of Newport, they were very disappointed. They had imagined a cheering crowd of local people and maybe also an important delegation of the American army to welcome them. Instead, only a colonel of the Rhode Island militia and a few of his officers welcomed them in what Chastellux called the deserted town of Newport. As explained by historians such as Desmarais and Selig, the city of Newport was reluctant to host another army. It had been occupied by the British Army for 3 years before, destroying the city's economy. And Chastellux described this in colorful terms in his logbook. The town of Newport is very pretty. The houses are clean and well built, but they show signs of misfortune and devastation. It is like a flower bed touched by the frost. They try to be a bit poetic there. So these from the logbook, by the way, are not published. They're all from the Chastellux papers. And so the British occupation had ended only 7 months before the French arrived, and the inhabitants of Newport feared a new invasion. Moreover, the precious aid that was sent just after the signing of the French-American alliance in 1778, of which they of course had high hopes at the time, of D'Estaing that I already mentioned, was still in their memories. And so they did not believe that this time the French would be of more help. And additionally to all this, prejudices circulated, ranging from the French being feminine, as you could see on the comic here, feminine, only occupied with curling their hair and painting their faces, to also them being dwarfs, pale, ugly specimens who lived exclusively on frogs and snails. These are quotes of the time. And there was even word that the French were sent by the Pope to impose Catholicism on the Americans. And these prejudices, of course, went back to the period of the 7 Years' War, where the British, alongside the American colonists, had fought against the French. So they were enemies at the time. So not that long before, they fought against each other, and now they had to fight with each other, which of course created a few complications. At the other side, the French also had their own prejudices against the Americans, such as that they were lazy, not used to work hard, and especially that they were more interested in money than in their own liberties. But luckily, these relations improved rapidly in the days and especially months after. The day after the arrival of Rochambeau and Chastellux on the shore, the town of Newport organized a warm welcome to the French. The town administration offered free liberty candles to the population so that they could put a little candle in front of their window so that the city looked well lit, and they organized a few events at the time too. And in the coming months, especially, the French would start to befriend the inhabitants of Newport by organizing balls, dinners, and lots of also other social gatherings that would prove very important to cement the American and French alliance and fight their prejudices. However, this was of course not yet the case at the total beginning, because there were other things to do. So in addition to all these hardships that are already described, at their arrival mid-July, the French generals received worrying letters from George Washington, as Chastellux communicated to his sister in a letter. He said, "Every day we have received letters from General Washington or governors of Connecticut and other neighbors of the British. They warn us that the British are planning a large embarkation of all their troops and an expedition that is clearly aimed at this island." So to protect his soldiers, Rochambeau decided to set up camp on the south side of the city facing the ocean, where the fleet of the l'Amiral de Ternay, of course, could protect the French expeditionary army against a possible attack from the British by sea. And Chastellux wrote again to his sister, "Indeed, the British Royal Navy will be a constant threat in the following weeks." On the slide right now, you can see where the camp was constructed. And so based on the research of Norman Desmarais, who made this specific map. So you can still see the streets today if you're aware with Newport, but it's interesting to see how the city developed now. And so to make their camp, they received help from the Rhode Island militia in building their encampment to collect material. But this proved again another disappointment for the French, because the militia seemed ill-disciplined and was especially wearing rags, as they said. The Americans seemed lazy to the French, not used to work hard, and especially they were not wearing uniforms, which of course stood in a stark contrast to what they were used to in Europe. So during their first week on American soil, the French were constantly occupied by disembarking and building the encampment and organizing the distribution of food, water, and medicines. This was another taxing undertaking. The French expected to easily find the much needed food and fresh water for their soldiers, but the local population could not provide much to them. And they could only sell what they could spare for very high prices. So mid-July, George Washington sent the Marquis de Lafayette to Newport to welcome the army in his name. Lafayette, as we all know, had joined the Continental Army in 1777 and served in the Continental Army directly under George Washington. So it's important to understand that he is not serving with Rochambeau, he's of course serving next to George Washington, but of course they will collaborate quite a lot. And so he stayed a week with the French to observe the works of the building of the camp, but also he was reconnoitering, which is a complicated word to pronounce, the region around it. And he did this with his uncle by marriage, Chastellux. So this was the first occasion for Chastellux to observe the lands around Newport and also its inhabitants, its forest, its agriculture, which was important to understand where they were staying and what they could use for the French encampment. It was also the occasion to catch up with his family relation and to learn from him on the American War. Lafayette and Chastellux were close, despite their age difference. Chastellux was in his 50s, Lafayette in his early 20s. Chastellux was the uncle of Lafayette's wife, so you might wonder how that works. This is a very complicated family tree, but of course you can see that Chastellux was Adrien de Noailles, Lafayette's wife's uncle. And so he used to grow up with Adrien de Noailles' mother, and so they were quite close. And so his cousin got married to Lafayette, and they saw each other very often in Paris. And especially during the American campaign, they would meet quite often too. They would travel together, they would do research on America together, and especially what you can see in their correspondence that's also kept in the papers of Chastellux, Chastellux could play a kind of a mentor role for Lafayette, as we will see in a few lectures. So to Rochambeau and his staff, Lafayette also transmitted the wish of George Washington to plan a French-American attack on the British in the well-fortified city of New York as soon as they could, probably in the coming weeks. New York was a symbol of the British occupation in America, and Washington had suffered his most humiliating defeat there. Recapturing the city could give the long and awaited final blow to the British. However, the experienced French officers had to disappoint Lafayette. Attacking New York was just impossible now. They were not at their full strength yet. Rochambeau was waiting for naval reinforcements and especially for extra 2,000 soldiers. In addition, his soldiers in Newport needed time to recover from all their diseases. So all these factors did not, of course, improve the frustration and the doubt that the French felt. They felt isolated, they felt abandoned by Versailles, by the king, because they didn't receive the new aid yet. They had to disappoint their ally by saying that they were not on their full strength yet, and they were afraid of getting attacked by the British. Well, Chastellux got back to his daily activities after Lafayette departed to provide food and shelter to the soldiers in the encampment of Newport. And he was also writing military reports for the French administration. French general officers like him were writing military reports and letters to inform the French King Louis XVI and his administration on the state of the French Expeditionary Army. And for his formal writings, Chastellux had two secretaries at his disposal to whom he dictated his reports, or of course, who made copies of his notes, which is very lucky for me because here you can see Chastellux's own handwriting, which is quite hard to decipher. So after sending these reports to France from Newport, on average, it took at least 3 to 4 months before an answer could actually come back. This was, of course, very complicated for the French because the communication with their administration was extremely slow, which, of course, made them feel more isolated, and they literally did not know what was going on, especially during the first year, because for a whole year they did not receive letters from France. And Chastellux is complaining about this to his sister, and he says they are not receiving any news, and so this augmented Chastellux's feeling of isolation in Newport. All in all, despite all this, the French officers did succeed, despite the hard conditions and with their modest means in quickly building their camp and organizing and protecting it well. However, even if the French were relatively safe in their well-fortified camp, the French generals did not feel confident about their military campaign in the future. And this can be very well illustrated by the fears expressed by Chastellux in several documents that are all, of course, unpublished and are now in the Chastellux papers. So first, after a few weeks in America, he wrote to his sister, in which he verbalized his feelings very clearly. He said, "Here we are in the middle of a suicide mission on the periphery of civilization." In addition, he tried to obtain permission to return to France. He wrote to the French king, Louis XVI, that he had fallen seriously ill due to the American climate and that he needed to come back to France. And to his sister, Chastellux admitted that he had indeed fallen ill, but that he wanted to take advantage of the situation to get out of America. He wrote to her that he could do more for France and especially the French army back in Paris. And in addition, he communicated his despair in more detail to a French minister in his what is called Mémoire sur les conditions de l'intervention en Amérique. And so this is one of these reports that he wrote to the French administration, in which, first of all, he asked for more help. He asked for example, money, tents, coats, provisions, all these things that la petite armée française, so the small army, was lacking. But of course, he went much further. And so I think is very interesting about this specific report is that Chastellux is not only mentioning where the French were staying and the situation they were in, Chastellux was going further in his research. He was trying to really understand why the French were tricked kind of in this situation. How could they not have foreseen where they were in, and how, what could the solution be to get out of there? So I'll focus a little bit on this specific report to show you how Chastellux was operating in Newport and how that was working out. And so this memoir is called, so a memoir, by the way, is not what in America you would call a memoir. A memoir is just kind of military report in this case. And so it's not clear to whom he was addressing this exactly, but he's calling quite often le ministre. So this could be a few ministers of France. It's not dated either, but it was very probably written in early September of 1780, given the content. So at the time, Chastellux and the officers of Rochambeau were living in homes in Newport, close to their camp. And Chastellux was living in what's called the Maudsley House, which is still standing today, but is privately owned, but you can still visit the surroundings. So I'm just showing where it is. It's located in Newport, just where the arrow is. And you can see that it's quite close to King Park, so where that statue is of Rochambeau. And what's even more funny is that actually there is a Chastellux Avenue just close by too, that is of course named after François-Jean de Chastellux. So to go back to this report, Chastellux, as I said, did not only give details and facts about the French Expeditionary Army, as was customary for these reports, he went further than most of his colleagues. He was wondering how the French could have been in such a desperate situation and what the solution would be. And so for this, he studied war as a real science. Just as his fellow French Enlightenment philosophers, he did not take information for granted. He conducted his own research based on multiple different sources, his own experiences and his own observations, which he would do in Newport and around it. And so he states it's only possible to understand these things while being in America. It's necessary to observe this in person. So after these observations that he made, that you can see reflected in the papers, because he wrote a lot of different comments and he made long lists of everything he could see in Newport. So he was studying, of course, the military aspects, but he's also studying the population, the commercial relations there, agriculture. He was trying to really understand everything you can imagine relating to warfare. And so after these observations, he realized that the French had not verified the information they received before leaving America. According to him, the French were tricked into their alliance during their military expedition. They had received false information on which they based their sending of the army. And Chastellux thought that this specific false information led to several dangerous misgivings on America that actually could prove fatal to the campaign. One of the most dangerous misgivings was on how committed the insurgents were to their cause. After observing the situation in Rhode Island, Chastellux wrote that about 2/5 of the population was royalist and would easily be recruited in the British Army. In addition, he stated that all the different states, so the 13 states, did not seem as united as they were made to believe before. In the near future, according to him, a dangerous schism would occur, from which, of course, the British would greatly benefit. Furthermore, there was no men, no money, no agriculture, as he wrote. The Americans seemed on the verge of bankruptcy, and to support them, France would have to send enormous amounts of money, which in the long run would be dangerous for France, as Chastellux announced prophetically. He also said that it was very likely that the Americans would turn back to the English after the war, and that the French would not benefit that much from the trade that they hoped to achieve by having this alliance. And to study that, he was studying the whole economic system, and he wrote a very large report on French-American commerce based on what he had seen in Newport. So the worst false information they received was on the state of the army. When Chastellux saw the Rhode Island militia in Newport, but especially when he heard about the condition of George Washington's army, he wrote, "All in all, we have contracted an alliance with rebel subjects. We will have to feed, to clothe, pay the Americans, and even fight for them. It is clear that America will not give us an extra vessel nor an extra man. This army is composed of militia, composed of men with miserable fortunes, and of some registered troops that are badly supplied, badly paid, and dangerously prone to desertion. The fact that the French believed that their ally was strong had led the king to decide to send only a small expeditionary army. After analyzing his own French forces in the American context as well, Chastellux concluded, "It seems like the army of Rochambeau will not even perform one shot. The aid we send to America is very mediocre and unlikely to give an advantageous opinion on our strength to our new ally, the Americans." And so how could the French actually have been tricked like this? Chastellux believed that the members of Congress deliberately had given this misinformation to France to obtain the necessary French military, but especially, of course, financial support for their war of independence. They were in dire need of this help and afraid that the French would not support them if they knew how desperate their financial and military situation was in reality. As a result, they had embellished their military and financial condition to the French. Moreover, a few merchants could greatly benefit from the French hardware that would arrive with the army of Rochambeau. And these merchants had played a very important important role in tricking these French too. And so he concludes with saying, "It is without a doubt very unfortunate that our minister has never received just and satisfying information on the real state of the insurgents." And as a solution, he proposed, it would be necessary that one or more officers of the army of Rochambeau would enlighten the ambassador La Luzerne on the photo. And these officers would travel in the country, see the army, and measure the disposition of the people. And so what Chastellux does here is that he advises to send French officers out on a very large research mission to inform the French army and the French administration on their conditions in the war, and especially to be able to plan an eventual future campaign. And so by doing so, Chastellux's memoir reflects, of course, a more personal emotion, disappointment, and fear. But more importantly, what you can see here is that it gives insights in the development, but also the application of the phenomenon of the military enlightenment, of which Chastellux is clearly a representative. So this is a topic I would like to conclude with tonight, but that will come back in the following lecture next month. And so this military enlightenment approach gives, of course, more insights in how that works, but it especially, sorry, I just lost what I wanted to say there. But anyway, so we can see in this report that Chastellux studies war as a real science. He's including economics, he's including political elements, he's including culture, all this to understand warfare and to understand how his own army could maybe start to win a war by proposing research. So you can see here that that's quite an enlightened approach. And so to understand this military enlightenment, we need some background. So as we have seen, Chastellux is this soldier philosopher. He has these two sides in him. And this phenomenon of soldier philosophers, as well as the military enlightenment, has stayed quite understudied. But recently, Christy Pichachero published a book about this phenomenon. And in this, she calls soldier philosophers the real representatives of this military enlightenment. And according to her, there are two types of soldier philosophers. The first is focusing on the military only and applies enlightened, rational approaches on military ideas and practices. And then there's a second category where you can see that these soldier philosophers apply, of course, enlightenment to the military matters, but they are much more broadly interested in, for example, literature, societal studies, in which they also apply their military approach. Pichachero does not mention Chastellux in her study, but of course he can be included in the second group of soldier philosophers. And so this development of François-Jean as a soldier philosopher started with his interest already and training especially in the mathematical principles of the military theorists of his time, which was starting in his entry in the French army in the late 1740s. you can see here that he was writing many military reports from the beginning onwards of his military career. And so, of course, the important defeat the French faced during the 7 Years' War, where Chastellux served as a colonel of his own regiment, it inspired Chastellux to think and write on the reforms that were needed for the French army, as did, of course, many other officers around him too. And as has been, of course, described by historians such as Jean Chagnot and Arnaud Guigné, but also the American David Bien and Rafe Blaufarb, after this disastrous 7 Years' War for France, French soldiers and administrators pointed out the problems and especially shortcomings of the French army that had become apparent during the losses of the 7 Years' War. And so Chastellux was part of this group, but he's never been identified as such because his papers were not known. So no one knew that he was actually belonging to this reforming group. And so he was writing quite a lot of reform propositions to the French ministers Choiseul and Belle-Isle. And in their correspondence, you can see that he had a real impact and influence with his proposals. And so what they were doing, this group of reformers, to understand the issues of the French army, they started to study the art of war as a science, as we have already seen in that approach of Chastellux. And so this phenomenon can be called the military enlightenment. And war had to be studied as a total system where mathematics, engineering, geography, meteorology, psychological factors, the terrain, but also even national character of the people and even the political organization of the nations at war. So all of these things had to be studied and were all in interplay with each other. So simply put, you can say that there was much more to war than just mathematics as was studied before this period. So you can see a real shift in this new approach based on enlightened principles. And so by studying more with this more enlightened approach, the troubles that the French identified were not only technical, they were much broader. They were involving the entire society and its values. Seeking to locate and especially define these issues, the military reformers drew on ideas that were sounding everywhere, in the army as elsewhere in society. Men were not serious enough. They were frivolous. They were inclined to idleness, failing to work in their professions. And it became clear that, among other weaknesses, the French army suffered from incompetent officers, poorly trained troops, and especially flagging patriotism. Indeed, high-ranking officers were not selected on their merit or their talent. They were based on their birth and especially their wealth, because they could purchase positions. Many of these officers were untrained and actually unfit for duty. And as a result, soldiers were not disciplined nor brave enough because of the behavior of their superiors, but also because of their health and their comfort were just not considered. And solutions for these kind of problems were to be found in the moral themes and ideals of the Enlightenment that were widely circulating in the period, such as to make the army more merit-based, as well as to take more care for the well-being of soldiers, to prevent, for example, the desertion and have more discipline. Chastellux wrote about this, but especially he tested his ideas in his own regiment. For instance, he studied the effect in a raise of payments on discipline, and he wrote about this. Moreover, reformers such as Chastellux studied successful military accomplishment of the ancient Greeks, but also the Romans, in search for a suitable model for the French military to emulate. Ancients utilized successful tactics, employed talented and skillful commanders, and were most of all deeply motivated by a sense of patriotism. Based on this, some concluded that the French military needed to become a citizen army. Patriotism would naturally ameliorate military problems by motivating troops to defend their country instead of an absolute king. And so this is where I come finally to the American Revolution, because out of a sudden, a new modern example presented itself to the French. Of course, this was at the other side of the Atlantic during the American War of Independence. As Julia Osman, a historian, has concluded in her research on the phenomenon in the early years of the revolution, the American Revolution piqued French military reformers' interest because the Americans employed tactical, organizational, but also inspirational methods that were reminiscent of the ancients. And so this ideal Roman and Greek citizen soldiers seem to have become reality at the other side of the Atlantic. And as shown by other historians such as Echeverria and Chinard, the French historians of the beginning of the 20th century, in France has led to a phenomenon called the American Mirage. So this was an idealized expression of the hopes that the American Republic could represent as a mirror to an inefficient and corrupted French system. Of course, this mirage did not correspond to the American reality. It was really an imagination of the French who needed a mirror to hold to their society. And we can see this too at Chastellux, in his Chastellux writings, because in his edition of 1776, the book On Public Happiness, as well as in many military reports, he showed that he had an admiration for the promises the American Revolution held, with his citizen army, a republic, a democracy, and liberties. However, as we have seen, his ideas changed because he could do firsthand observations. He saw a real contrast to this legend of this American mirage with this Republican citizen army, and he got quite disappointed, as we have seen. And so this gives us a further understanding of this feeling of desperation of Chastellux, but it also especially gives insight in this enlightened mentality of the French that were serving in America, especially that of Chastellux, of course, but you will see in the following weeks that they're more like him and that they had the same approach to warfare. And so what makes him especially interesting to study this phenomenon of the military enlightenment is that he was one of the very rare French philosophers that could go to America, and that he was actually that he could apply his abstract theories to the realities of war. So he could test his ideas, he could adapt the ideas, he could to see if they could change into different contexts. And so, as we'll see in the following lectures, these Frenchmen that were in America, like Chastellux, they used the army as a space of experimentation. So you have to imagine, of course, that the 7 Years' War led to this new sort of wave of this military enlightenment, but they had never tested their ideas because there was no war in between. And so this was the first war where they could really apply and test their new ideas, their new approach, and this enlightened vision on war. And so what we can see here is that this application of this enlightenment in America didn't only help in the development or evolution of this concept, but it especially helped in winning the American War of Independence, as we will see later. And so this also shows that the traditional separation of military and intellectual history in the study of War of Independence as two distinct and separate fields inherently misses connections between them. So it can be said that the Age of Enlightenment was also an age of war. So to come back to Chastellux in Newport, after sending up this memoir, but also the letter to this French king that we remember where he was pretending to be very sick, but also to his sister, he received a letter from his, who was quite worried. He sent a warning from Versailles, mentioning that many at court considered leaving America for Chastellux to be desertion. So luckily for Chastellux, the answer of the king arrived only mid-August, so the following year. And he actually did receive the permission to come back to France from the king, but Chastellux did not return. His opinion had drastically changed over the winter, which we'll see in the next episode, let's say, of this lecture, because in the winter of 1780 and 81, he would actually conduct this research mission that he proposed to understand America better and to fight all these prejudices and to see the reality in front of him. And so he would do this research tour in North America, in different states, under the orders of Rochambeau, who really gave him the explicit orders to do so, as he had advised too. And he worked in very close collaboration with George Washington himself, but also many other French and American officers. And so what we will see is that these encouraging research results of the reconnaissance tour contributed to a real shift in the mentality of the French from this desperate situation to actually newfound hope to be able to fight the British. And of course, this is quite an underappreciated collaboration between the French and American that would start in the winter following their arrival. So I'll discuss that more in depth next month. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Iris. And I know we've gone over our time a little bit. We do have some time for some questions. If you would, please put your questions in the chat box and I'll read them to Iris. and she'll answer them. And I can say while we're waiting for any questions, Iris, you've pointed out something very neat, which is you mentioned that General Chastellux was relatively forgotten by history, and it is evident from the work that you're performing that he will not be forgotten by history. In fact, you're doing a great service to him, and also to helping us understand the American Revolution, and that France played a very prominent role in helping the United States in securing our freedom. And just thank you for highlighting that today. And I'm just going to check the chat box here and see. You're getting a lot of people praising you for a great presentation. I don't see any questions yet. I can tell you, I've learned so much from this. I did want to ask you, how old was General Chastellux when he arrived here in 1780?
So he was born in 1734. So he was 46 years old
Wow.
when he arrived. Yes.
So he's my age then.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, that's amazing.
Yes.
And let's see, people are still saying bravo, Iris, and you get a lot of thank yous here. Let's see. A question for you that I have while we wait for some questions also is, who was in his chain of command? So if he had to make a report, would it go directly to General Rochambeau, and then General Rochambeau, would that go to the King of France? How was that chain of command?
Yes, exactly. So Chastellux there were three major generals directly under Rochambeau. And so Chastellux is considered third in command, but so he had to report to Rochambeau, and Rochambeau would create another type of report, or he would reassemble a few reports and create another one based on different visions, let's say, and he would send that to Versailles afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you. And we have a question here from Mary. I'm sorry, people are typing in the chat box now, so it's scrolling while I'm trying to read it. It is, let's see, Mary has a question about Chastellux' feelings of being deliberately misled. Were they shared by other French observers? And is there evidence from American records that the misinformation was used strategically in the way he suspected?
So yes, I've seen several other French observers thinking the same, but they developed the reasons why a little bit less than Chastellux would do that. But I have seen other journals, especially that are, by the way, published today, but in which French would say that they did believe that they were tricked, or at least they were so disappointed because they had imagined really something else to find in America, because of course, especially the strength of the Continental Army, the numbers of the soldiers, and the financial state of Congress and the army was just very disappointing by what they said. And I also, what I've read from, for example, Benjamin Franklin was quite known to have deliberately given some false information in France itself, to Vergennes and to the French ministers and French administration, the French king, to convince them to help in the American cause. Yeah, so I hope that helps. Like, he was not the only one, but Chastellux really was developing much further. He was explaining that the local population would turn much more clearly to the British. He was considering the whole economic system. He was doing all that research to really find out how they could have been tricked and the ways in which they were tricked.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And a question from Susan is, will the family allow the documents to be scanned and available to others? And she says she cannot wait to see your book, and she wants to know how she can get a copy of it.
So yeah, the documents scanned is an ongoing debate with the family since I've been finding, or at least using, the documents. Of course, at the beginning, I was doing my dissertation and I wanted to keep it for myself, let's say, to finish the dissertation. But since then, the family has already sold quite some documents, actually, in Christie's auction in, I think, 2017 and 18. So letters of George Washington, Jefferson, and a few military reports have been sold. They're kept in facsimile, by the way, by the family. And so the rest, for now, they don't want to scan them, or at least digitize them. But I'm working quite hard trying to convince them to do so, because I think it's quite important that they come available for the larger community of course, researchers. And especially Mount Vernon, where I'm working with quite a lot, they would be very interested in helping with this project. But the family still has to agree upon that. And it's, of course, a complicated decision for them to make, because they have inherited so many and like these huge material collection. And they don't really know what to do with it, I think, yet. But I'm quite sure that at one point they will digitize it.
And I have a question
about the book. The book has still to be finished yet. So I'm working with the University of Virginia Press, and my editor Nadine said she would maybe be here today, but I don't know. I can see the whole thing. But anyway, I will finish the writing probably this year, so it will be available in a year or two from now. So then you can get it wherever.
That's great. And then we have a question from Gardner, and it was Chastellux a member of the Society of Cincinnati?
Yes, he was. So he was one of the first members. In his papers, there's this Foundation Act, I think it's called, but of the Society of the Cincinnati. And he was also especially involved in the discussions that were held about the Cincinnati become hereditary. And so he was writing about that subject with several people. He didn't write to Washington directly, but he was writing with, I think, Henry Knox and Schuyler and a few other Americans about this complicated question, of course, at the time about the Cincinnati.
And this is a question from Stephen, and he says, didn't Rochambeau know about the topology and warfare in America prior to coming due to reports of many French volunteers? One of the first orders on the way to America was to reduce the standard line of 3 deep to 2 deep based on the experience of volunteers, and that has a question mark.
Mm. Yes, so of course the French knew, but I think they didn't know everything. So they already had, of course, information from the 1778 expedition. They had lots of reports and documents that were from both the American side and the British side that they could do research on. I can see that too in Chastellux' own archive, where he was collecting lots of material before leaving to America. So he was doing research on that, and they had information. I just think that when they were on spot, they realized they didn't have all the information. And so they sent, for example, geographers to make accurate maps because they did not have them at their disposal. And so they needed to do more additional research. Of course, they were not completely overwhelmed, but what you can see in Chastellux is you can really see that there was quite a panic almost of what they did not know. And so the French volunteers, it's interesting, in that same report, the Mémoire on les conditions de l'intervention, he's telling about the French volunteers that had also helped to mislead because they wanted the help from the French too. He's not naming Lafayette specifically, but he said that they were also embellishing the situation because they wanted the same help. And there's also, so there are reports from La Luzerne and Conrad Gérard before him, in which you can see the same kind of feeling of who to believe and how do we do this. And it's true that about the second question about the line of the 3 to 2 deep standard line, so that is the whole discussion of l'ordre profond and l'ordre mince, which was a huge debate in the French army on specific column formations within the army. And it's true that the Continental Army was already applying these because they had access to specific theorists of France, mainly Guibert, his name is. And so he was working, by the way, quite a lot with Chastellux on thinking about what kind of formations to use in an attack within the army. And so Guibert, his work had quite an influence, especially through von Steuben, who is, of course, called the drill master of Valley Forge. But so these Europeans brought European tactics and strategies with them. And so, yes, they had them already in place too. But I would be interested in doing more research on what was already in place and what Rochambeau brought exactly and how that influenced each other.
Wow, great information. And we have a few more questions here. This one's from Constance. And her question is, would you suggest that a study of the ideas of Enlightenment and the military Enlightenment could be effectively told and shown somehow on the Washington-Rochambeau National Historic Trail? And would love to think about how to stimulate a discussion on the ideas of enlightenment. That may be more of a statement there, but the question was about would you suggest that a study of the ideas of enlightenment and military enlightenment be effectively told on the trail?
Mm. Yeah, I think to show it to a wider audience, that of course implies some sort of a different approach, I think. But what could be done is, for example, to show that for the French, there was we could say the American War of Independence, which is very much, of course, related to the military history. But then there's also the story of the revolution, so the political revolution that was in place, the societal, the social, the economic revolution, all these different signs. And I think on the route itself, you can, by going to specific places, you can show the military enlightenment approach of the French by going maybe to a battlefield and explain it there. But you could also, for example, go to a city like Philadelphia, where lots of French came together to discuss, let's say, the promises that revolution held, being more equalities, more property, or more sort of democracy, of course, quite relative, but still they could observe these things there, and they would discuss it with the local population. They would gather in intellectual communities, intellectual circles. They organized many gatherings, and especially Chastellux, but also other officers were joining what you could say were like the intellectual circles, such as the American Philosophical Society, where you can really see this exchange of the Enlightenment through these officers with some of the leading American intellectuals. And especially Chastellux represents that quite a lot, because he became member of 5 of these learned societies. He went to different colleges. He met, of course, Thomas Jefferson. And so you can really see these two sides of the revolution, being the military, but also the more revolutionary side, if you want, combined within this military enlightenment. So I think on the route, you could combine these two by telling, both of these stories. But it would need some reflection on how to do that exactly. But I think you could do that for sure.
And our next question is from Catherine, and she would like to know, will she be able to order your book in Français?
Yes, you can. So it will be published by a publisher called Honoré Champion. And normally it's going to come out in about a month from now, because I received already a sort of try publication, I don't know how you call that. But so I could post it somewhere if you're interested, because I will be able to order that.
And the next one is from Frederick, and he said, excellent presentation. Do you plan to follow Chastellux Trail here in the United States? Please let us know if you're in New England, almost New France, they have in quotation marks, or parentheses, excuse me. Governor Shirley and Lewisburg may also interest you.
Okay, so thank you. That sounds very interesting. So I have been sort of following the whole trail Chastellux when I began my dissertation. So that was a few years ago. I did that on my own with a car, which was a very fun activity to do, because it was so nice to be able to read the journal, and at the same time see how actually quite a lot of things were still the same, and at the same time they were, of course, very different, because if you go to New York, obviously there was a small village or town, and now of course it's, well, New York City. But at the same time, there are quite a lot of places that were very similar to what he described. For example, West Point or Fishkill, or like lots of different towns where he would describe specifically homes that are still existing. He would describe nature and specific animals that are still everywhere. So I was very inspired by that trip. So I would love to come to New England again, if there would be interesting things to do there, and Lewisburg would be interesting too. And I went back there because we're making a documentary film on the same project. So my book is becoming kind of a documentary. And so for that, we traveled the whole route again last March.
Excellent. And next is from Jenny, and I'm not sure if this is a question or more of a statement, so maybe if you want to just reflect on it, but it said, that is true about Benjamin Franklin providing a glowing report of American resources, but the French spy Bonvelour, and I'm sure I'm saying that name wrong, but the French spy Bonvelour, who first met with him in December 1775 in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, embellished the American state of things also. His report to Virginia's, I know I'm saying that wrong.
Vergen, that's the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time.
Painted America as a dream with an exclamation mark and a smiley face.
Okay, so yeah, the glowing report of Benjamin Franklin. And so you can see indeed quite some reports that are embellishing the situation there in America. I think it would require some further research for me to figure out how exactly that was, like how many of these super positive reports existed and how many were already painting the more, let's say, realistic image. That would be, I think, interesting to discover a bit more.
Perfect. And this one is from Lorenzo, and he said, would you say Chastellux is an unsung hero? Shouldn't he have more exposure with a documentary, for example?
Well, yes, obviously, because that's what I am doing now. But the unsung hero is, of course, quite a term that would say that he is not well known or not remembered. And I do think that that's totally the case because his travel diary has been published, of course, but it has never, all the rest of his papers and his correspondence have stayed quite unstudied because, of course, they were not available. There are lots of other reasons to point out why he is an unsung hero, but yeah, I would love to have a documentary and the book and maybe even a series about him, which I'm actually all working on. So, yes.
That's awesome. And just a couple more things. This is a statement maybe for a reflection from you, and that is from Larry, and it is perhaps the most important lesson for today is that the alliance of France and the United States, and in parentheses, and Spain and India and the Dutch Republic defeated the world's largest empire, which had no allies at all. Alliances beat out going it alone every time.
Yes, well, thank you, Larry. That is very true. And in his own book, of course, he describes very well this overstretching of the British Empire, because, of course, France was assisting the Continental Army, but at the same time, they had a front in the Caribbean, they had a front in Africa, they had a front in Asia, one very close to Great Britain at the I think it's called the English Channel, La Manche en français. But they were outstretching the English with the help of the Spanish and the Dutch. And so, of course, this led to the fact that the British had to post the army and their navy almost everywhere, all the corners of the world. And so they were on their own. They had no ally. And so the others had, and they could overplay them. And so they could win the war because of that. And I think that's quite an interesting point, because this more, let's say, global approach of the American Revolution has stayed quite, unknown to the broader public, of course, to the, let's say, academic community. It's quite researched already, this whole Atlantic Revolution and things, but the American Revolution being, one stage in a global conflict would require, I would say, some more attention or need more attention.
Great. And our last question of the evening is from Mila. And she says, thank you for an interesting presentation, Iris. In your opinion, had the French not provided assistance to the Continental Army, would the ultimate outcome of American independence have been different?
I would say yes, of course, because the French have played quite a pivotal role in the specific moment in which the independence was gained. And so I would say, of course, they would have received their independence at a later stage in history. Of course, it was not, I don't think they would have never gained it at the time, but with the help of the French, they would have at the beginning already, they had weapons, they had money, and they had clothing of course, within that sort of first stage of the secret help. They had lots of French engineers and officers that would go to join the Continental Army too, and gave their expertise of building a new army. Of course, the Continental Army themselves had very talented officers too, but they needed more experience from let's say, the old world to be able to fight the British Army, which of course was highly trained and very embedded in this European tradition of warfare. And so they needed a European ally to beat them. So I would say that is very essential. So yes, I think the ultimate outcome of the American independence would have been different without the aid of the French, because I think that the Continental Army themselves would never have been able to really beat the British. They had lots of little victories, but they were mainly beaten down, and especially their financial losses were becoming very important. But it has to be said, of course, that what we just said in the previous question, with this overstretching of the British Army, that was mainly the strategy of which the French were also responsible. So the British were forced to give the independence to America at the time.
Outstanding presentation, Iris. I'm just totally wowed. Thank you so much, and just really appreciate you being here today, helping us kick off National Park Week, and look forward to your future presentations, which you'll be holding every month. And on behalf of the National Park Service and the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route National Historic Trail, thank you for all the time and work that you've put into this presentation this evening. Very, very informative. And I'd like to, if you don't mind finishing off with any final words or anything that you want to say, and thank you for your time. And also for those of you who joined in a little bit late, I did want to say Iris is joining us from France, where it's about 12:30 in the morning there right now. So thank you for your time this evening, Iris.
Well, thank you all very much for listening, and I'm very happy to have presented the research. I have to say it was a bit complicated for me with Zoom because there's no reaction. Normally you're in a room and you see people laugh or at least look at you as if you're saying something very weird. But since I've noticed myself in the beginning, I was quite nervous because it's weird to talk on my own and sort of see darkness in front of me because it's midnight right now. So, but anyway, I hope it was still informative, and I'm very happy with all the comments that I can see here. It's very, very helpful and inspiring. So thank you very much. And thank you very much, Johnny, for organizing this lecture series. And I'm again very happy to present my research in this platform with all these very well learned and interesting people that are all so invested in this Washington-Rochambeau revolutionary route. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, Iris.
Thank you.
Excellent, Iris. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pierre-Antoine de Champs.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.
And I might get some friends of mine who are reenactors. We can actually dress the part next time.
Oh, I would love that.
You would? Okay.
Yeah, that would be funny.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.